Buyers may end up paying more than ever before thanks to the recent settlement of the NAR litigation. It's important to understand how compensation works. So let's take a little look here. Now, previously, in a previous structure, so we have a buyer who's bringing all the money to the table. We have a buyer's agent who's representing this buyer. We have a house, and then we have a seller who owns the property, and we have a listing agent who's gonna be selling the property. Now, typically, we would have the buyer who would give the compensation to the seller. The money's coming from the buyer in the first place already. Let's remember that. We're gonna come back to that. And then now the seller is gonna say, okay, dear listing agent, I'm gonna pay you some compensation. And then listing agent is gonna say, okay, buyer's agent, I'm gonna pay you some compensation. So the money went from the buyer to the seller, seller to the listing agent to the buyer's agent. Now we're saying in this new structure, we're just saying, okay, we're gonna have some money go to the listing agent, or the seller, some money go to the listing agent, and the buyer is now responsible for the buyer's agent compensation directly. That's fine because the money always came from the buyer anyway, went from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, maybe it just goes from 1 to 4 now. This is simple, this is easy. But guess what? Previously, when buyer had to pay all this money to the seller, they, if they're getting financing, only had to put down a percentage. Maybe they're putting down 10%, 15%, 20%. So now they're putting a percentage of the down payment to the seller. The seller is paying to the listing agent, and the listing agent is paying to the buyer's agent. But guess what? If we're now paying for this directly, the buyer cannot finance that fee, and the buyer may have to be out of pocket a higher amount, and that will be the same amount of compensation to the buyer's broker, but more money out of pocket to a buyer. So if lenders can't figure out how to make this work, if our financial system can't figure out how to make this work, it may cost buyers thousands. But guess what? If a buyer has to pay more out of pocket, what do you think is going to happen to the price that a seller is going to be able to get? They're going to be able to get less money because it's going to cost them more. So the previous structure may actually save a buyer thousands and get a seller a higher net price. So let's continue. If we want the house, we also have to remember that a seller's price, if it includes the buyer's agent commission, we're going to have a set price here. But if it no longer includes the buyer's side compensation and the buyer's going directly to here, this price may look smaller because a buyer didn't have to pay as much money. So we now have to be aware of, how do we compare your neighbor's house compared to the house you're selling? What if all of a sudden your house pays for less? Don't focus just on the public list price and the public sold price. You just care about your net. How much is this seller walking away with at the end of the day? Really important to keep in mind. All right, so now we talked about how compensation works, where technically the money was always coming from the buyer. Now it's just maybe in a different way, but it may cost a buyer more money, and it may cost a seller a difference in their purchase price or their sale price. So let's also remember, part of this NAR settlement agreement also now says in the previous structure, most of the compensation was coming from the buyer to the seller, seller to the listing agent to the buyer's agent. Now that's not guaranteed. In fact, it's saying that you are prohibited from offering any kind of notation of compensation. You can still pay that compensation, but we can't advertise it in the MLS. Now, this buyer's agent has no idea if they're going to get paid or not. And so the litigation says the buyer, if they want to see the properties in the MLS, in the multiple listing service, they now are required to have a signed exclusive buyer broker agreement with that agent saying this agent is going to get paid X amount. This agent needs to understand how to establish their value. Are they worth 1 chip, 2 chips, 3 chips? Are they going to ask for some money up front? Are they going to have a set fee? Are they going to have a higher fee or a lower fee? These are all now completely on the table because there's no longer a set standardized compensation for that agent. And now we need to have an agreement up front in writing. This is actually good. This is the good part because now we get to be more transparent. We get to have a clear agreement of who's working for who. We get to talk to buyers about how we're paid and why and when. The part that's tough is it may cost this client more and it may cost this client more as well. So what does this actually mean for you? Well, be sure to check out my other videos to figure out how this impacts the industry.